By the time the coach wheel sank to its axle in black November mud, Catherine Muller could no longer feel two of her fingers, and still she bent for another trunk because no one else would touch it. Rain ran from the brim of the driver's hat, and from the noses of the horses, and from the torn edge of her mantle, which had once been dark blue and now held the colour of dishwater. The London road had become a churned ribbon of clay. Every step took work. Her hem dragged heavy as rope. The leather of her left shoe had split near the instep that afternoon, and rainwater seeped in until each step made a soft, humiliating sound. The gentleman nearest the coach had already moved beneath an awning to protect their boots. The women lifted their skirts and turned their faces away. A boy of perhaps 15 watched her lift a valise twice her breadth, and laughed without malice, as if she were part of the weather and no more important. She set the valise on the stones, drew breath that hurt her throat, and went back for the hat box. "Girl," the driver called, not looking down at her, "mind the brass corners." She nodded because speech cost warmth. Her right palm burned where Li had opened a line across it that morning. Lady Voss had judged the copper pans unsatisfactory and sent the kitchen maid to mark it, then placed the brush in Catherine's hand with a look that made refusal a fantasy. The Li had climbed under her nail beds. She had rinsed in cold water, wrapped rag around 2 fingers, and sorted accounts until dusk. Then the packet had been tied and handed to her as if it were a favour. "Deliver these to Fleet Street. Return at once. No, you do not need a companion. No, you do not need coin." A useful girl walked. The rain thickened while she crossed to the posting inn. She had waited in a side passage for the clerk who never came, then stood another hour because she had been told to wait, and by the time she reached Lady Voss's house the lamps were low and the side gate locked. She had knocked. She had called through iron. The porter had opened the shutter and looked down as if she were an errand left too long in the cold. "Her ladyship has retired. I have not eaten since morning. The kitchen is closed." He had shut the slit. That had been 3 hours earlier. Hunger now came in steady pulls under her ribs, no longer sharp, almost clean. She had learned that stage. It meant the body had ceased arguing. Another trunk, another slippery step. A man in a green travelling coat passed close enough that his shoulder struck her arm, and he did not turn. A woman with pearls said to her companion, not softly, "She is plain as a fence post, but strong enough for hire." Her companion answered, "Useful if kept silent." The phrase landed with a sting because Lady Voss used those same words in drawing rooms scented with rosewater, always with a laugh, always when guests could hear. Catherine lowered her head and took the next burden before the driver grew impatient. She was 22, old enough to know that pity was rationed to beauty and innocence, and she had been allowed neither. Dark hair clung in wet strands against her cheeks. Her face had gone thin in the past year. People saw hollows first, eyes second. They called her plain because plain required no apology. No one noticed the shape of her mouth when she pressed it hard to keep from shaking, or the steadiness with which she counted sums in her head while carrying luggage through rain. No one noticed because noticing carried duty. At last the final trunk was wedged beneath tarpaulin and rope. The coachman flicked mud from his cuff and tossed her a look as thin as her mantle. "That is done. Off with you." She stood still for a moment, not from defiance but from the absurd wish that someone might ask where she was meant to go. No one did. Wheels lurched, hooves pulled. The coach groaned free and rolled on, lanterns shrinking into mist. The awning emptied. The boy vanished. The road swallowed all of them, and she remained with rain stitching down the back of her neck and a dark city stretching west. She put her hand under her bodice and touched the oilskin packet. It lay flat against her ribs, warm only because she had held it there all day. Inside, folded close, were copied figures in her careful script. Dates, rents, storehouse tallies, signatures that should never have matched and did. She had written each line by candlelight while the household slept, the nib trembling when floorboards creaked. Lady Voss had sold tenant grain once on paper and once in cartloads, then blamed shortages on storms that never came. She had signed the dead man's name with a flourish she thought no one remembered, but Catherine remembered. Catherine had watched her father write receipts at the library table while rain struck the orchard glass. His hand slanted left at the end of every surname. He dotted with care. He never looped the M. Her father had died 2 winters earlier. The fever had taken him by stages, and debt had taken him all at once. He had guaranteed notes for men who vanished when collectors arrived. He had not told her. He had looked at her once, near the end, and said he was sorry for the paperwork. She had not understood then. She understood now. Her mother followed him before spring crocuses opened, and grief in that house became an accounting opportunity. Lady Voss took the Müller silver first, then the orchard lease, then the upstairs rooms. Letters from old friends were placed in a basket for sorting and never seen again. One evening, passing the rear court, Catherine had watched smoke rise from a copper brazier and seen a corner of her own name curl to ash. She had said nothing. Silence kept roofs over tenants' heads 1 month at a time. By the 2nd week of November, creditors had begun arriving on market days in pairs. The city narrowed around her as she walked. Gas lamps hissed. Water ran along the gutters in bright ribbons. Her shoes rubbed each heel raw where damp leather hardened, then softened, then hardened again. She kept to walls when carriages passed to spare her from full spray. Once a carriage wheel sent up a sheet of dirty water that struck her skirt to the knee, cold enough to steal breath. She staggered, caught herself on brick, and went on. Bread smell drifted from a baker's close door and almost undid her. She pressed her teeth together until the moment passed. At a crossing near Holborn, a constable lifted his lantern and looked her over from mantle to shoes with practised indifference. "Home is east," he said. "Thank you," she answered, though she was headed west. She did not trust her voice with more than 2 words. If she told the truth, he might send her back to Lady Voss's gate. If she lied badly, he might ask questions she could not afford. Better to keep moving. Better to look like a servant late from errands. Servants were invisible. Invisible women survived. The rain eased to a hard mist. Then it returned, finer and colder. Midnight bells travelled unevenly through stone and fog. Her shoulders ached from carrying weight that was never hers. Her stomach folded in on itself. Twice she leaned against a wall and counted to 20 before forcing her legs forward again. She had crossed half the city with water in her shoes and iron in her blood, because one address on the copied page still held authority strong enough to make fraud expensive. Ravensmere House, Grosvenor Square. She had written the name so often in margins that the letters now rose before her, even with eyes half closed. Everyone knew the Duke of Ravensmere in the way people know winter storms. A widower, a fortune, a house where petitions were sometimes heard and sometimes burned unopened. A man who had dismissed guests in the middle of supper when conversation bored him. A man who did not forgive public incompetence. None of that mattered beside the fact that his stewards had clashed with Lady Voss twice over grain contracts, and neither side had forgotten. Power might ignore suffering. Power rarely ignored theft from its own accounts. Near Hanover Street, she stopped beneath a narrow portico to wring water from her skirts with both hands. Her palms shook. Skin around her knuckles had split white and red where soap and cold had done their patient work. She thought of turning back only once. The thought lasted the span of a single breath. Behind her waited a locked gate, a kitchen without supper, and another dawn of ledgers altered to ruin men who still touched their hats when she passed. Ahead waited risk of a different sort. She chose the road with witnesses. When Ravensmere House emerged from rain, it did not gleam. It loomed, stone darkened almost black by weather. High windows with only two lit, iron railings slick as ink. The lion-head knocker shone where hands had polished it over decades, bright metal in a field of wet shadow. She stood on the pavement and looked up until the back of her neck ached. Her breath came in short clouds. Water dripped from the end of her hair and tapped against the packet beneath her dress like a second pulse. No carriage waited at the curb. No caller stood under the lamps. The square held that late-hour stillness that was not peace but suspension. She climbed the steps because there was nothing left to lose that had not already been taken in smaller pieces. At the top, she lifted her hand. The brass felt like ice. She struck once. The sound entered the house and vanished. She struck again, and this time she kept her hand on the metal as if steadiness might travel through it into her bones. She held the knocker a moment longer after the second strike, not from ceremony, but because her hand had begun to tremble and she could not afford to look weak on a stranger's step. The brass pressed cold through split skin. Rain slipped from her sleeve to her wrist and disappeared under the cuff. Behind the door there was no immediate movement, only the thick silence of a large house where heat and light cost money, and servants slept in ordered rows of rooms she had never seen. She listened for bolts, for footsteps, for refusal. None came. Waiting dragged open all the other waitings that had shaped her life into this night. She had waited beside her father's bed while fever burned him down to voice and bone. She had waited at the breakfast-room threshold while Lady Voss finished a story before granting permission for bread. She had waited outside the steward's office while men discussed rents as if her family name were already gone from every ledger. She had not always been a girl turned from gates. There had been years when she ran the orchard paths with ink on her fingers and no fear of locked doors, when the cook called her Miss Catherine without checking who was near enough to hear. In those years her father kept account books in calfskin and asked her to sharpen his quills. He had said numbers told the truth if a hand wrote them cleanly. He had said debt was a tool, never a master. Then came the contract signed to shield men he trusted from wartime shortages and transport losses, each guarantee neat and proper, each one tied to cargo that vanished or arrived spoiled, and when claims were called in sequence there was no sequence left in him, only surprise that became shame. She remembered the day the first collector came with a folded demand and a clerk's soft voice. Her father had stood in the library window, one hand on the sill, and answered with the calm of a man who believed paper could still be argued into reason. By Michaelmas, that belief had collapsed. By Christmas, his hands shook when he lifted a teacup. By late January, he apologized for paperwork in a whisper she had to bend to hear. He died before the thaw. Her mother lasted through 2 more months of morning calls and whispered inventories, then followed him into that same cold ground, and the house changed ownership in everything but deed. Even now Catherine could smell the church stone and wet wool and candle grease from those funerals, and with each breath at Ravensmere's door she swallowed the old taste of wax and helplessness as if it were present rain. After the morning black came Lady Voss in violet silk, precise as a blade, already speaking of efficiency before the final condolence card had been opened. She had entered rooms by scent and sound, lavender first, then the rustle of expensive fabric, and servants learned to straighten before her shadow crossed a threshold. Catherine had learned faster. "Useful if kept silent," Lady Voss would say when guests asked about the plain young woman carrying tea, and laughter would follow because cruelty dressed in wit was still accepted as wit. The word plain became a tool in that house. It excused every theft. Plain girls did not require new boots. Plain girls could eat in kitchens after the family had done. Plain girls could surrender their mother's cameo for safekeeping, their father's watch against debt, their own room for more suitable use. 2 stepsisters arrived with trunks that smelled of perfume and starch, both of them beautiful in the obedient fashion the world rewarded, both quick to inspect what could be removed from Catherine's possession without open scandal. One took the green wool cloak from her wardrobe and wore it to market by noon. The other claimed the walnut writing desk because it better suited her complexion when she sat at the window with embroidery. A week later they argued over ribbons, while Catherine mended linens by candlelight at the kitchen table and listened to them mock the way she spoke, too exact, too clipped, too serious for a woman with no dowry. She did not answer. Answering fed them. Silence preserved strength for tasks that mattered. Lady Voss replaced household books with new ledgers and assigned the old steward to distant parcels until he resigned. She moved the lockbox keys from the study to her dressing room. She changed suppliers, changed rents, changed terms, changed signatures where signatures should not have changed. At first, Catherine believed the irregularities were panic, then expedience, then something temporary that would settle once creditors accepted staged payments. They did not settle, they multiplied. Bills were paid by stripping labour from those too poor to contest and grain from stores already promised elsewhere. Men who had farmed Miller land for 20 years received notices written in legal language designed to frighten them into surrender. Widows were told arrears had compounded. Teamsters were told loads had spoiled when Catherine had watched those same wagons leave full and dry. Every week brought another small humiliation for her and another large extraction for Lady Voss. She was denied carriage, denied coal, denied coin for thread while violet silk arrived in crates. She was told to scrub copper until her hands split, then to copy columns by lamplight until the letters blurred. She obeyed because each day of obedience brought one more day before families were put out into winter with no appeal. The packet under her dress had begun as an act of memory and became an act of defiance by degrees so slight she could deny each one if asked. A wrong date first, then a repeated tally, then a signature with a loop her father never used, then a rent line copied in 2 books with 2 outcomes. She took scraps when she could. She wrote at night in the attic room moved to her after her own chamber was given away, knees under a narrow table, one candle shielded by a chipped saucer so no light leaked beneath the door. She copied figures in Clark's hand and dried pages by the window where frost filmed the inside glass. Once, in early October, she woke to footsteps on the stair and slid papers under the mattress so fast the ink smeared across her thumb for 2 days. Another night she heard Lady Voss below, entertaining an officer retired from quartermaster work, and through the vent she caught fragments about contracts and substitutions and county men who could be managed if approached correctly. Catherine wrote names then too, though names were the most dangerous lines to carry. By the 2nd week of October she had begun checking the granary keys each evening under pretence of sweeping the passage. 3 days later she watched 2 covered carts depart at dawn and return empty while the book for that day recorded no transfer. She copied that page before breakfast. When letters came addressed to former tenants, Lady Voss sent them to the brazier unopened if the seals looked cheap. Catherine rescued what she could from ash, fingertips blackened, eyes stinging. One letter named a magistrate willing to review claims if proof existed. Another named Ravensmere's steward as a prior complainant in a dispute over diverted barley. The name struck hard. Ravensmere House meant risk, but it also meant reach. She began to fold every copied sheet into oilskin and stitch the edge by hand so rain might not destroy it. She hid the packet under her stays during daylight and beneath a loose floorboard at night. She measured meals by whether her hand still steadied enough to write. She measured fear by the sound of Lady Voss's step in the corridor. Once, in late October, Lady Voss entered the attic unannounced and stood near the table while Catherine pretended to mend cuffs. Her gaze moved over the room and paused at the floorboard Catherine had shifted that morning. She said nothing, only smiled and told her there would be no supper unless the silver had been polished again. Catherine polished until midnight and did not spill a drop of water, though her knees shook. The next day she moved the packet to her body and left it there. Now on Ravensmere's step, with rain in her shoes and hunger hollowing her centre, all of it stood behind her like a court of witnesses that could not speak unless she did. Her father's apology, her mother's quiet hands folding mourning veils, Lady Voss's voice carrying through drawing rooms, the sisters in stolen wool and laughter, tenant children counting potatoes in late autumn because grain promised to them had gone missing on paper first and in wagons after. She could still see Mr. Hale from the lower fields twisting his cap and saying he would pay by Candlemas if given till then, while Lady Voss examined her gloves and replied that sentiment was not an accounting method. She could still hear Mrs. Finch asking whether her lease was truly void and getting no answer except a notice pressed into her palm. Those faces had followed Catherine through every mile of the city tonight. They stood with her now at this black stone door, soaked and patient, and waiting to be either dismissed again or finally entered in a ledger that counted them as human. Wind pushed rain across the square in slanted lines. Her teeth touched once from cold, then held still. She lifted her hand from the knocker and tucked it against her ribs over the oilskin packet, feeling its stiff edges, reminding herself that proof existed outside memory. If the door opened and she was turned away, she would still have the papers. If the door opened and she was searched, she would have one chance to demand the steward before anyone else. If the door did not open at all, she would walk to the magistrate named in ash-stained correspondence when daylight came, and if that failed, she would find the newspaper office on Fleet Street and force a public record by any means she possessed. She had reached the point where fear no longer changed the arithmetic. Behind her lay a locked gate and a life measured in commands. Before her stood carved stone and uncertain mercy. From deep inside the house, at last, she heard the scrape of a bolt and the deliberate turn of a key. The key turned once, then again, and the door opened only the width of a man's shoulder. A footman stood in the gap with a lamp held high and impatience already fixed on his face. He was middle-aged, precise, powdered and dry. The contrast between them was so stark it almost seemed theatrical. His spotless cuff, her mud-dark sleeve, his polished shoes, her split leather soaked through to skin. "Service entrance is at the rear," he said. "I do not seek service," Catherine answered, and her voice rasped from cold. "I must speak to the Duke's steward tonight. His Grace receives no callers at this hour. This cannot wait until morning." His gaze dropped to her skirt, to the frayed mantle, to the water running from her hem onto Ravensmere stone, and hardened into official contempt. Petitions are submitted by letter. Return in daylight." She held her ground. Rain struck the iron railing in quick metallic taps. "If I leave, 12 tenant families lose their leases before week's end." The footman's expression did not change. "I do not debate matters of lease with strangers on the threshold." He began to close the door. Catherine moved without courtesy and placed her hand flat against the oak. Pain shot through the split in her palm. She did not pull back. "Then summon the housekeeper. I will wait in the hall and speak to no one else." The footman drew himself up, scandalized by the touch. "Remove your hand." A cry cut through the corridor behind him. High, sharp, followed by a heavy impact that shook the lamp flame sideways and sent 2 maids gasping at once. The footman swore under his breath and turned. The door opened wider by accident, then wider still when Catherine stepped past him, before he chose whether to stop her. Cold air rushed into warmth. Candlelight flashed across black and white tiles, slick with rain carried from boots. At the far end of the entrance hall, near the first landing of the stair, a small figure lay, twisted, on the stone runner, one arm bent wrong from the fall, a fair head turned against the edge of a step. A nursemaid knelt 2 paces away, frozen by terror. Another servant stood with both hands over his mouth. "Do not move him," Catherine said, and the command cracked through the hall with a force she had not used in years. No one asked who she was. In crisis, authority mattered more than rank for one breath, sometimes 2. She dropped to her knees beside the boy. Water from her skirt spread into the pile of the runner. His lashes fluttered. Breath came, shallow and quick. A narrow line of blood ran from his temple into his hair and then stopped, thin but bright in candlelight. Catherine set 2 fingers against the side of his neck and counted under her breath. 2 fast. She placed her palm lightly against his chest, rising, falling, still with her. "Can you hear me?" she asked. His eyelids trembled. A soft sound left him. Not words yet. "Good, stay still." The nursemaid found her voice in a frightened burst. "Master Leo slipped, miss. He slipped. I turned only for a moment." "Hush!" Catherine did not look up. "You can help him now. Hold the lamp lower. Not in his eyes." The woman obeyed at once, hands shaking, but obedient. Catherine tore the loose edge of her undersleeve with her teeth, and one hard pull. Fabric gave. She folded it twice and pressed it to the cut at the boy's temple. Careful, steady, firm enough to stem bleeding, gentle enough not to frighten him back into panic. He whimpered, his fingers clutched at empty air. "I'm here," she said, softer now. "Do not turn your head." The footman had recovered his outrage. "Madame, you will step away at once. You have no authority in this house." She lifted her eyes to him, dark and direct, rain still dripping from her lashes. "Then fetch someone who does. Boiling water, clean linen. A physician if one sleeps under your roof, and if not, a rider to Brook Street. Quickly." He hesitated. Training fought common sense across his face. She did not wait for his choice. "Now!" He ran. By the first hour after midnight, the great houses of London carried sound in strange ways, and every order became public knowledge in 3 corridors. Doors opened overhead. Steps pounded. A maid hurried forward with blankets. Another brought a basin and nearly dropped it when she saw the blood. Catherine caught the rim and set it down herself. "Not on him," she said. "On the floor. Good." The boy's pulse settled by degrees beneath her fingers, not calm but less frantic. She could smell beeswax and wet wool and the copper edge of fear. The nursemaid whispered prayers into her own sleeve. Catherine ignored the words and watched the boy's pupils for focus, the rise of his ribs, the colour at his mouth. She had done this once on a toll road in October, when a carter's apprentice took a wagon pin through the forearm and bled too fast for bystanders to keep their heads. She had done it with mud under her knees, and strangers shouting and no one willing to touch the wound. She had not thought of that night in weeks. Her body remembered every motion before her mind reached it. Boots struck stone behind her. Slow, deliberate, heavier than any servant's tread. The noise of the hall changed around that sound. Conversations stopped. Even the nursemaid went still. Catherine looked up. He stood beneath the arch from the inner corridor in riding black, darkened by rain, gloves in one hand, great coat unfastened, shoulders broad enough to fill the passage. His hair, nearly black, was wet at the temples. His face held no visible strain, but it held nothing soft either. The line of his jaw looked cut from slate. His eyes were pale and cold as winter water. They moved first to the boy, then to the cloth at the boy's head, then to Catherine kneeling in soaked skirts on his hall floor. Everyone bowed. No one spoke his name because no one needed to. The Duke of Ravensmere crossed to the tiles and stopped beside them. He did not ask for explanation. He did not ask why a stranger was touching his household. He looked at the improvised bandage, at Catherine's torn sleeve, at the blood on her hand. "Report," he said. The word landed like a bell strike. Catherine answered before the servants found breath. He fell from the landing. He struck the right temple. He remained conscious, then drowsy. Breathing has steadied. Pulse was rapid and is improving. The Duke's gaze shifted to her face. He took in wet hair plastered to her cheek, hollow skin, trembling fingers pressing cloth in place. His eyes dropped once to her wrist where old bruises yellowed near the cuff. When he spoke again, his voice stayed level. "Name." "Catherine Müller." A flicker crossed one of the maids. Recognition, perhaps, or alarm at hearing a surname at all from the drenched woman on the floor. Ravensmere looked toward the footman who had returned with linen and a copper kettle. "Mr. Hale, my lord." "Send for Mr. Ellery immediately. Wake him if needed." "Mrs. Davies to the hall." "Yes, my lord." He turned back to Catherine. "Is he in danger?" She chose honesty and precision because anything else in this room would destroy her. He may worsen before dawn if the blow is deep. He must be kept warm, kept still, watched for confusion, vomiting, unequal pupils, seizure. The nursemaid made a distressed sound at the last word. Catherine did not soften it. Better fear now than neglect later. Ravensmere crouched, one knee to stone, coat spreading around him like dark water. The movement startled every servant in sight more than the fall had. Dukes did not kneel in entrance halls, not for children, not for strangers. Yet there he was, close enough that Catherine could smell rain and horse leather on him, close enough that the heat from his body touched her frozen fingers. He spoke to the boy, and his tone changed by a degree so slight most would have missed it. "Leo, look at me." The boy's lashes lifted. His gaze found the Duke's face and steadied. "That is it," Ravensmere said. "Do not move." "Uncle," the boy whispered and tried to turn toward him. Ravensmere's hand came up at once, not restraining, only bracing lightly at the shoulder. "Still." Catherine watched the Duke's fingers. No shake, no fuss. Control laid over fear with military discipline. She had seen that discipline in soldiers and in men reading foreclosure notices, with tenants waiting outside. It did not fool her. His stillness was too deliberate, too expensive. Mrs. Davies arrived in a plain dark gown, grey hair pinned without ornament, eyes keen as awls. She took one look at Catherine kneeling beside the boy, and at the Duke beside both, and asked no useless question. "Blankets," she said to the maids. "Bricks to warm the bedchamber. Thomas, clear the corridor. You're breathing too loudly." Servants moved. Ravensmere rose in one fluid line and faced Catherine. Up close, the difference in rank between them felt like a physical wall. He stood dry enough to command a county. She knelt, soaked, muddy, half-starved, with torn cloth in her hand and an illegal ledger under her bodice. "Can he be carried?" he asked. "Not yet," she said. 2 minutes, let him orient, then 4 men level and slow, no jolting. Heads supported." He nodded. "Once. You will direct them," she blinked. "My lord, I did not ask what you are." The line cut clean. Not cruel. Final. Leo stirred and winced. Catherine leaned close. "You must tell me your full name." He swallowed. "Leonard Ashcombe Ravensmere." "Good." She held his gaze. "Do you know where you are?" "At home." "Do you know who this is?" She tipped her chin toward the Duke. A weak, indignant look crossed the boy's face. "My uncle. He shouts when I climb the banister." Something almost changed at the corner of Ravensmere's mouth. Not quite a smile. Gone in a breath. "Very good," Catherine said. Relief moved through her like warmth and almost made her sway. She ignored it. "Now keep your eyes open." When the physician arrived 10 minutes later with his coat half-buttoned and his spectacles crooked from haste, Catherine had already supervised the transfer to a narrow settee near the fire, had changed compresses twice, and had made the nursemaid repeat warning signs back to her until she got them correct without sobbing. Mr. Ellery examined the boy with brisk competence, confirmed her cautions in different language, and set a tincture by the bedside for pain when needed. He glanced once at Catherine's improvised bandage and gave a short nod of professional acknowledgement. Nothing more, nothing less. The hall emptied by stages. Panic drained out, replaced by exhausted order. Leo slept lightly with Mrs. Davies in a chair beside him and the nursemaid at the foot of the bed twisting her apron. The physician remained in the next room to write notes. Footmen carried away wet cloths and the basin. The rain resumed its hard percussion against the windows. Only then did Catherine remember where she stood and in whose house. She was still in the entrance hall, now streaked with drying mud from her shoes. Her skirt clung cold to her knees. Her hand had begun to ache where Lie had cracked it open. Hunger returned in a dizzy wave that made the edge of the marble console blur for one alarming second. She pressed 2 fingers to it until the floor steadied. Ravensmere had not left. He stood near the fire but did not warm his hands. His coat had been removed and hung. Beneath it his waistcoat was plain black, cravat tied with severe precision. He watched her with an attention that felt invasive only because it was accurate. "You are injured," he said. She glanced at her palm. "It is nothing." "Liar!" The word was quiet. It struck harder than shouting. He stepped closer. Not enough to touch. Enough that she could see a pale scar at the edge of his left jaw, disappearing under his collar. His eyes moved over her once more, cataloguing. Mud at hem. Torn sleeve, bruised wrist, shaking hands. "You are soaked through," he said. "Your right hand is split. You have not eaten." Catherine held his gaze because looking away felt like surrender. "I came on urgent business, Your Grace." He extended his hand, palm up, as if requesting a document from a clerk. "Then give it!" For one pulse she did not move. The oilskin packet under her dress seemed to burn against her skin. If she handed it over now, she lost control of the only leverage she possessed. If she refused, she might be put out into rain before dawn, with no second chance. She slid her hand inside her bodice and drew out the packet. Water had darkened the outer fold, but not breached the stitched seams. She placed it in his hand. His fingers closed around it carefully, almost ceremonially. He did not open it at once. "Who sent you?" "No one. Who knows you are here?" A pause. "Lady Voss knows I did not return." His expression changed by a fraction. The name had meaning in this house, bad meaning. Mrs. Davies reappeared at the doorway, took in the scene in one glance, and waited. Ravensmere did not look away from Catherine. Tea, food, dry clothing. Use one of Anna's wool gowns from the West Press. Mrs. Davies inclined her head, but uncertainty flickered. "Your Grace, the lady may prefer—" "She will not leave," he said. Catherine's breath caught. He spoke to her directly, each word clipped, controlled, unarguable. "You will eat, you will warm yourself, then you will sit in my study and explain every line in this packet." She should have answered at once with gratitude or obedience or fear. All three were present. None reached her tongue. Ravensmere looked at her another moment, as if measuring whether she would bolt like a frightened animal or stand like a witness. Rain hammered the panes behind him. Somewhere deep in the house a clock began to strike 1. When the last chime faded, he gave the order that left no room for refusal. "You will not leave!" The order settled over her like a cloak dropped on frozen shoulders, heavy and inescapable. Catherine lowered her head once. "Yes, Your Grace." Mrs. Davies came forward at once, practical as iron. "This way, Miss Muller." Catherine followed because her knees might fail if she remained standing still. The corridor beyond the hall was warmer, lined with dark portraits and narrow tables polished to a black gleam. Her wet shoes left prints on every carpet she crossed. Each mark felt like trespass. She kept one hand over the front of her dress by habit, then remembered the oilskin packet was no longer there. The absence startled her more than the cold. Proof had passed from her body into his hands. There was no recalling it now. Mrs. Davies opened a small sitting room near the back stair and closed the door against the draught. Coal glowed in the grate. Steam rose from a teapot already set out, as if the house had expected disaster and kept one room prepared for it. A maid entered carrying folded garments, a dark wool gown, a chemise, stockings thick enough for winter, and a plain shawl that smelled faintly of cedar. "Behind the screen, miss," Mrs. Davies said. "I shall call for hot water for your hands." Catherine stood behind the screen and peeled wet cloth from skin that had gone numb. Her fingers refused the buttons twice before obeying. When she drew Anna Ravensmere's gown over her shoulders, the wool held warmth like a held breath. She almost wept from relief and refused herself that indulgence. Tears changed nothing. She folded her own ruined dress as neatly as if it were silk and set it on a chair. When she came out, bread, broth, and tea waited on the table. Mrs. Davies watched until Catherine lifted the spoon. "Slowly," the older woman said. "If you eat too quickly, it will return." Catherine obeyed. The broth tasted of chicken and thyme and salt. The first swallow hurt. The second steadied her. By the 6th, her hands shook less. "Master Leo asks for his mother when he wakes in the night," Mrs. Davies said, voice low. "He has done so for nearly 3 years. If he does so now, tell him only that he is safe. He knows no comfort from falsehood." Catherine set down the spoon. "Will he be moved to the nursery?" "In an hour, if Mr. Ellery permits." "And the stair," Mrs. Davies's mouth tightened. "Waxed this afternoon, too slick for running feet. I have told them so for months." Footsteps passed the door. Male voices. One of them, the footman, thin with indignation, even in a whisper. She forced entry. His Grace cannot mean to keep her. Mrs. Davies crossed the room in 2 strides and opened the door before he could finish. "If you have strength for gossip, Mr. Hale, you have strength for useful work," she said. "Fetch fresh coals for the nursery and keep your opinion to yourself." The door closed. Silence returned. Catherine looked into her tea. "He is not wrong. I did force entry. You kept the boy from swallowing his tongue while my staff argued rank." Mrs. Davies poured more tea. "Eat." By 2 a.m, the house had settled into the strained quiet that follows panic, when every hinge sounds louder than it should. Catherine was led back to the room where Leo lay. The fire had been built up. Warm bricks wrapped in flannel rested by his feet. His colour was better, though his skin remained pale against the pillow. Mr. Ellery sat at a writing stand, spectacles now straight, recording pulse and pupil response at quarter-hour intervals. "You may sit there," he told Catherine, indicating a chair beside the bed. "Do not allow him to sleep longer than 10 minutes at a stretch until 4. Wake and question him each time. If he vomits, call me before the basin is emptied." "I understand." The nursemaid rose when Catherine approached, eyes red-rimmed and swollen. "Miss, I'm so sorry. I should have caught him." Catherine touched her sleeve. "Take 10 minutes near the kitchen fire, warm your hands, then come back." "I cannot leave him." "You cannot hold him steady if your hands are shaking this hard." The girl stared, then nodded and slipped out. Leo stirred, his lashes fluttered open. Confusion crossed his face first, then fear. "Do not move," Catherine said softly. "You fell. You are safe." His lower lip trembled. "My head hurts." "I know." "Where is Uncle Julian?" She glanced toward Mr. Ellery. The physician kept writing, listening without looking up. "He is in the house," she said. "He will come." Leo swallowed hard. "I was not meant to race on the landing." "No." "I did anyway." "Then you will recover and obey tomorrow." A small pained sound escaped him that might have been a laugh if his head had hurt less. His eyes drifted closed. "Leonard!" She touched the blanket near his hand, not his skin. "Open your eyes. Tell me your full name." He obeyed with the grave patience of ill children and recited it again. She asked where he was, who his physician was, what day it had been before supper. His answers came slowly, but they came. Mr. Ellery set down his pen. "Good. Continue until 4. When the nursemaid returned, Catherine put the basin into her hands and showed her how to support the child's shoulders without jarring his neck. She made her repeat every instruction. She made her say them in order. The girl managed all of it by the 3rd attempt. In the corridor outside, 2 maids paused with fresh linens and peered in. One whispered, "She speaks like a governess." The other answered, "She arrived like a beggar." Catherine heard both and kept her eyes on the child. A quarter-hour later, Leo vomited into the basin with a weak cry. The nursemaid lurched back in fright. Catherine held the basin steady, wiped the boy's mouth with clean linen, and called for Mr. Ellery before the second wretch had finished. The physician examined Leo's pupils, adjusted the tincture dose down, and nodded once at Catherine. "Correct response," he said. "Many would have forced the draft first. I did not wish to cloud his signs." "Quite." He returned to his notes. The nursemaid stared at Catherine as if she was seeing her for the first time, not as an intruder but as a person shaped for crisis. Near 2:30 the door opened without warning. Ravensmere entered and stopped just inside the threshold. He had changed into a dry coat, still black. He did not approach at once. His gaze moved from his nephew to the basin, to the list Mr. Ellery had begun, then to Catherine seated rigid with fatigue, one hand wrapped in fresh linen where the lie cracks had split wider. "Report," he said. Mr. Ellery answered first. "Concussion, not grave if no further decline before dawn." "She has been precise." Ravensmere looked at Catherine. "You should be resting." She rose because he was standing. He has vomited once, Your Grace. Pupils remain even, speech intact, drowsy but rousable. You are shaking, she had not noticed until he named it. From cold, it passes. He stepped closer to Leo's bed. The child opened his eyes and reached weakly toward him. Uncle! Ravensmere sat on the edge of the mattress with a care that seemed learned through pain. He took the small hand between both of his and did not speak for several breaths. His broad shoulders had carried command all night. Now they held something far more difficult, waiting without control. Leo whispered, Do not dismiss Elsie. The nursemaid made a choking sound at the far side of the room. Ravensmere's gaze lifted sharp. Who told you she would be dismissed? No one, but she cried. Ravensmere looked to Catherine. Step outside with me. Mr. Ellery glanced up, then back to his notes. Catherine followed the Duke into the corridor and closed the door behind her. The passage was lit by 2 lamps only. Their light cut his face into planes of gold and shadow. He held the oilskin packet in one hand. He had carried it with him. You have not opened it, she said before she could stop herself. Not yet. His tone gave no apology. Speak. She knew what he asked. Not about the ledger, about the child, about blame. The nursemaid turned for a blanket, Catherine said. The stair was overwaxed. The child ran. All 3 facts are true. And which one matters? All 3. His eyes narrowed. You are careful. I am accurate. Silence stretched. Rain scored the windows at the end of the passage in long diagonal lines. If I ask this house for statements, he said, they will bend toward whichever answer protects their post. Yes, Your Grace. If I ask you, she met his gaze, then you will receive what occurred, not what is convenient. A muscle moved once in his jaw. You forced your way into my hall. Yes. You gave orders to my staff. Yes. You preserved my nephew's airway and likely spared him a worse injury. She did not answer. Ravensmere watched her another moment, then said, You will write the incident record. Catherine stared. I am not in your employ. Tonight you are. He held out the oilskin packet, then withdrew it before she could take it. After the record. From the door behind them came the nursemaid's muffled sob. Catherine turned toward it by reflex. Go, Ravensmere said. She went back in. The next hour passed in measured tasks. Question, wake, observe, note. Leo drifted, woke, spoke, and drifted again. Once he cried out for his mother in a hoarse whisper that pierced the room. The nursemaid began to cry with him. Catherine sat on the chair's edge and took the small hand in both of hers. You are not alone, she said. Listen to me. Inhale for 3. Exhale for 3. He copied her breathing because children will follow rhythm when words fail. She hummed under her breath. Not a song from drawing rooms, but an old miller's lullaby her father used when thunder shook their windows in her childhood. Simple intervals, no flourishes. Breath made music before mind judged it. She did not know Ravensmere had returned. He stood in the doorway without sound, one shoulder against the frame, and watched while she kept his nephew anchored through the pain. When Leo's breathing steadied, Catherine opened her eyes and saw only the nursemaid and physician. The doorway was empty. She did not think of it again. At 4:15, Mr. Ellery declared the danger reduced. He may sleep now in longer intervals. Wake him each half-hour until sunrise. If no new symptoms, he will recover with rest. Relief moved through the room in a single visible exhale. The nursemaid sagged against the wall and covered her face. Catherine rose too fast and caught the bedpost to steady herself. Mr. Ellery noticed. You will sit before you fall. I am well. You are vertical by stubbornness alone. She sat. Mrs. Davies arrived with a tray and set it beside Catherine without comment. More tea, bread, and a small dish of honey. "Eat while warm," she said. "His Grace requires you in the study once the physician clears the child for transfer." Catherine looked at Leo. "I can remain until daylight." Mrs. Davies followed her gaze. "You can. But there are matters below stairs only you can set in order now." Catherine understood. The incident record, the ledger, the first accounting line in a new house, perhaps the only one that would ever carry her name in ink that could not be burned at whim. She drank the tea. Her hands had stopped shaking. When the transfer came, she supervised once more. 4 footmen lifted the mattress board beneath Leo and carried him level to the nursery, as instructed. Catherine walked at the head, one hand hovering near his shoulder in case he stirred. The corridor lamps had burned low. Dawn had not yet entered the windows, but the black outside had softened toward charcoal. In the nursery, with Leo settled and watched, she finally turned away. Her body protested each step as if weight had been tied to her ankles. Mrs. Davies led her down 2 floors to a smaller study near the main library, not the Duke's principal office, but still richer than any room Catherine had entered in years. Shelves lined one wall. A map of county holdings covered another. A fire burned low. 2 candles waited unlit beside a writing stand. Ravensmere stood at the desk with his back to her, shoulders rigid, head slightly bowed over the open oilskin packet. Pages lay spread before him in a precise fan. He had arranged them by date. He did not turn when she entered. "Sit." She sat. He lit 1 candle, then the second, and finally looked at her. Whatever he had read had altered the air between them, not softened, focused. "Write the incident record first," he said. "Name each witness, name each action in order. Include your own entry without omission." Catherine took the pen he offered. The nib scratched across laid paper in a line steadier than she felt. She wrote the time of the fall, the position of the child, the first response, each instruction, each symptom, each intervention, each physician recommendation. She listed names: Mr. Hale, Mrs. Davies, Elsie Turner, Thomas Reed, Mr. Ellery. At the end she wrote, "I entered without invitation after hearing the child's cry and acted prior to formal leave being granted." She sanded the page, shook it clean, and passed it across the desk. Ravensmere read it in silence. He signed beneath her line with a hard black stroke. Then he rang once for a footman. Mr. Hale appeared at the door, face composed. "Take this to the household file," Ravensmere said. "No copies altered, no additions. Mrs. Davies will countersign by breakfast." Mr. Hale took the page, glanced once at Catherine, and bowed. "Yes, Your Grace." When the door shut again, Ravensmere placed his hand on the stack of copied ledgers between them. "Now," he said, voice low and absolute, "you will tell me how Lady Voss learned to forge a dead man's hand so well, and why you chose tonight to bring this to my door instead of any magistrate in London." Catherine lifted her eyes to his, exhausted and fully awake at once, and began with the first falsified date. She gave him the entry from March, when 40 sacks of barley had been listed as blight loss, though the weather records showed no rot that week. She gave him the second ledger line, copied 2 nights later, where the same 40 sacks appeared as private sale through a broker in Kent. She spoke the broker's name. She spoke the clerk who witnessed the transfer. She spoke the amount paid and the amount declared, and the difference between them. Ravensmere did not interrupt. He stood with one hand on the desk and the other on the packet, still as carved stone while she built the case line by line. She moved to April, a forged renewal in her father's name, dated 4 months after his burial, a lease extension voided by margin note in another hand. 2 rent increases imposed on widows who had signed only 1, a transport bill for wagons that never came through the eastern gate. She told him where she had stood to see the carts leave at dawn. She told him which groom had looked away when she asked why the seals were wrong. Her voice stayed level until she reached the names of children turned out with their mothers from 3 cottages near the lower fields. Then the levelness cost her, and he saw the breath she had to borrow before continuing. "Why no magistrate first?" he asked. "Because magistrates ask who benefits from accusation," she said. "Lady Voss dined with 2 of them this autumn. 1 sent her lilies after supper. And the 3rd? He might have listened. He also sends his accounts through her solicitor." Ravensmere's gaze sharpened, but his tone did not rise. "So you came to me because my steward contested her grain claims in September?" "Yes." "And because you believed I would move against fraud tied to my contracts regardless of your standing?" "Yes, Your Grace." She kept speaking. "June, July, August." She gave dates until the year felt flayed open between them. The room smelled of coal and rain-damp wool and the iron tang of ink. Candlelight thinned the hollows of her face and made her eyes look larger, darker, almost fever-bright with concentration. When she finished the sequence of wartime substitutions, she reached for the teacup beside her without looking and found it empty. Her hand shook once. She set it down before it could rattle. Ravensmere opened a drawer and withdrew 3 folded sheets tied with black thread. He laid them beside her copies. His fingers were clean, precise, military in motion. "Read the first line," he said. Catherine leaned forward. The script on his sheet was hers, not an exact page from the packet, but her hand without doubt. The long-tailed G, the clipped T, the narrow spacing she used when paper was scarce. The line named a shipment altered in transit and redirected through a warehouse near the river. Her pulse kicked hard against her throat. "Where did you get this?" "A note delivered to my steward in early October. No signature, no return mark." He slid the 2nd sheet toward her. Another line in her hand, this one warning of duplicate claims filed under 2 counties. The 3rd sheet carried only 3 names and 1 date. Men who had profited from missing grain. Men she had heard once through a floor vent while Lady Voss entertained. "I did not send these to you," Catherine said. "No, you sent them to the Fleet Street office with instructions to publish if anything happened to a woman in Lady Voss's household. Their clerk brought them to me instead of print." Her mouth parted. "How did you know they were mine?" He held her gaze, and for the first time since she entered his house there was a fracture in his control. Not softness. Something narrower and more dangerous than that. Recognition stripped of distance. At the Hartwell Toll Road on the 11th of October, a wagon axle snapped on whetstone. A carter's apprentice nearly bled out before my surgeon reached him. A woman in a torn grey mantle bound his arm with her bare hands and ordered 3 men twice her size as if she had the right. She left before I could speak with her. She dropped a scrap when she stood. 2 numbers, 1 surname, written in this hand. Catherine stared at him. The night at the toll road rose whole in her body, rain driving sideways, mud at her knees, a boy white with shock, someone shouting for cloth, a dark rider dismounting through the confusion. She had not looked at his face then. She had not dared. "You were there," she said. "I was." She swallowed. "You kept the scrap." "I kept the scrap. I found the surname in county accounts. I traced the discrepancies to Lady Voss. I began waiting for the woman who wrote it." He did not move while the words settled. The fire shifted behind him. A coal collapsed with a soft crack, and orange light ran once across his jaw like drawn steel. His eyes never left hers. "I have been waiting since October," he said. The line hung between them with the weight of an oath, not a flourish, a fact he had chosen to expose and could not call back once spoken. By the first grey hint of dawn, the rain had thinned to a fine hiss against the upper panes. Catherine felt the room tilt by a degree and steady again, waiting since October. For her hand, for her name, for proof, for this moment with ink drying between them, and no witness but stone walls and 2 guttering candles. She was too tired for vanity and too wary for trust. Yet something in her chest shifted despite both. "You were waiting for evidence," she said carefully. "For evidence, yes." His voice stayed low. "And for the person who would risk carrying it." A knock sounded. Mrs. Davies entered with fresh tea and stopped when she read their faces. She set the tray down without clatter. Ravensmere spoke before Catherine could rise. "Remain," he told Mrs. Davies. "You will hear this." Catherine looked from one to the other, startled. Household matters were witnessed. Protective declarations were witnessed. Public facts were harder to erase than private promises. He knew it. Mrs. Davies knew it. The air in the study tightened. Ravensmere turned back to Catherine. "You cannot return to Lady Voss's house. My things are there. You will list them. They will be sent for. She will accuse me of theft. She already has reason to fear exposure. Accusation is certain regardless." Catherine pressed her bandaged hand flat to the desk. "If I remain here, she will call it conspiracy, impropriety. She will say I traded lies for shelter." "Let her!" His jaw set. "I am done allowing her to define the record." The words struck with clean force. Mrs. Davies lowered her eyes, not in submission but in acknowledgement that she had just heard a line crossed. Ravensmere reached for the bell pull, then stopped with his fingers on the cord and looked directly at Catherine. "Listen to me," he said. "From this hour you reside under my roof as estate witness and protected correspondent. You will have wages entered in the household books, a private room, and access to the document chest in my study. Any person seeking to remove you without my written order will be denied at the gate and reported to the magistrate." He rang once. The sound cut through the corridor beyond like metal on glass. There was no retreat from that declaration. It named her role. It gave her legal footing. It tied his name to hers in the one way society could not dismiss as whim, recorded employment under ducal authority, with purpose and witness. Catherine stared at him. "Your Grace, do not refuse on principle," he said. "Refuse only if my terms fail to protect your tenants." He had found the one argument she could not evade. Her throat tightened with anger at the precision of it and relief she refused to show. She tried again from another flank. "If I stay, your household will resent it." "Some will." His expression did not change. "They will learn." The door opened. Mr. Hale appeared, composed and pale. Ravensmere did not look at him. "Enter this in the Morning Register. Miss Catherine Müller is appointed temporary correspondence secretary to my office pending formal hearing on Voss estate accounts. She reports to me and to Mrs. Davies for household arrangements. She is not to be hindered, questioned at the gates, or discussed in corridor gossip." "Repeat it." Mr. Hale repeated every line, voice clipped. A muscle moved in his cheek on the final clause. "Good," Ravensmere said. "You will carry the written order to the porter before sunrise." "Yes, Your Grace." "Go." When the footman withdrew, silence returned in waves. Catherine heard the blood in her ears and the faint scratch of sleet at the glass. Mrs. Davies poured tea into a clean cup and placed it by Catherine's hand, then withdrew to the wall, but did not leave, keeping her witness as instructed. Catherine did not touch the cup. "You move quickly." I move before opposition organises. You speak as if this were campaign. It is. His gaze dropped once to her split knuckles beneath the linen. Different terrain, same arithmetic. She did not mean to ask the next question. Fatigue lowered every guard she possessed. Why me? His answer came without hesitation. Because you did not lie when lying would have been easier. Because you entered a hostile house to save a child who had no power to repay you. Because you kept records under coercion and carried them through a storm alone. Because I will not send you back to be broken for doing what my own stewards failed to do in time. The room went very still. Mrs. Davies looked down at her hands. Catherine felt heat rise under skin gone cold for hours. A dangerous warmth. Not comfort exactly, but recognition landing where no recognition had been offered in years. Ravensmere stepped to the far side of the desk and took up the principal ledger from her packet. He opened to the forged renewal in her father's name, then to the comparative sheet where she had copied his true hand from older books. His thumb rested beside the false flourish. She practiced this for months, he said. Yes. She expected no one to remember the difference. Catherine's voice thinned at the edges and held. I remembered. His eyes lifted to hers again. I know. A second knock came, softer. Mister. Ellery entered, grey with fatigue and ink smudged at one cuff. Your Grace, Master Leo sleeps with stable pulse. No further vomiting. He woke on command and named place and date correctly. Ravensmere inclined his head once. Some rigid line in his shoulders eased by a fraction. Thank you, Ellery. The physician's gaze moved to Catherine. And you, miss? Your hand requires proper dressing before infection sets in. I can tend it later. You cannot. Ravensmere spoke over her in the same breath. Now. The two men exchanged a brief glance of professional impatience and long familiarity. Ellery set his case on the side table and opened it. Catherine looked from one to the other and almost smiled at the futility of resistance. Almost. Her mouth did not quite manage it. She held out her hand. Ellery unwound the linen, cleaned the lye splits with warm diluted spirit, and applied salve that stung hard enough to water her eyes. She did not pull away. Ravensmere stood 2 paces distant, and did not move while the dressing was secured, as if motion might disrupt the narrow balance in the room. When Ellery finished, he packed his instruments and bowed. She should sleep at least 2 hours before writing further. She will, Ravensmere said. Catherine began to object. There is more to list. August transfers, witness initials. Later, his command cut clean. You will sleep while your hand still closes. She looked down at the new bandage, white and precise against reddened skin. She looked at the copied ledgers spread like exposed bone across his desk. She looked at Mrs. Davies, steady as a chapel pillar, waiting for the choice. Catherine drew breath. If I sleep now, I wake before 8. We continue with the wartime contracts first. Ravensmere's mouth shifted once. Not quite a smile. It vanished at once. Agreed, he said. He gathered the copied sheets into ordered stacks, tied each with ribbon, and placed them in an iron dispatch box set beneath the desk. He locked it, then removed the key and held it out. Catherine hesitated. Take it, he said. You copied them. You keep access. Her fingers closed around the key, still warm from his hand. Metal bit into her palm, a small object, a non-trivial transfer of trust. Ravensmere turned to Mrs. Davies. Prepare the blue room near the west stair. Post no maid inside unless requested. Send broth at 7, and place a writing desk there. Mrs. Davies inclined her head. At once, Your Grace. He looked back at Catherine one final time before she rose. His voice dropped, quieter than command, but no less absolute. You are safe in this house. The words landed harder than any order he had given all night. She rose on unsteady legs, the key in her bandaged hand, and followed Mrs. Davies toward the door while dawn pressed a thin, colourless light against the study windows, and the Duke of Ravensmere remained exactly where she had left him, still beside her evidence, as if he could not yet bear to step away. At the west stair, Catherine looked back once and saw him through the study door, one hand braced on the iron dispatch box, head bowed as if he were listening to a sound no one else could hear. Mrs. Davies settled her in the blue room, banked the fire, and left the broth untouched on a side table when sleep took Catherine before she could lift the spoon. She woke to a soft knock and grey morning pressing through heavy curtains. Her body ached in clean lines. Her hand throbbed beneath Ellery's bandage. The key still lay in her palm where she had fallen asleep gripping it. She washed, dressed in a plain brown gown, borrowed from the house linen press, and crossed to the study before 8, as promised. Ravensmere was already there. So were Mrs. Davies and Mr. Hale. On the desk lay the incident record, now bearing Mrs. Davies's counter-signature, and beside it a sheet in Ravensmere's hand titled Chain of Custody. "Read it," he said. Catherine read each line. Oilskin packet received from Miss Catherine Muller at 1:10 in the morning. Opened in presence of His Grace at 4:40. Contents listed by date and page count. 3 anonymous October notes from Fleet Street office attached as corroborative exhibits. Incident report from Household Fall attached as unrelated but time-stamped witness record. Dispatch box sealed at 5:50 with key transferred to Miss Muller. She looked up. "It is accurate." "Then sign." She signed. Ravensmere signed beneath her. Mrs. Davies signed as witness. Mr. Hale stepped forward with sealing wax and pressed the Ravensmere crest into 2 packets, one for the magistrate, one for the county clerk. His hands were steady, but he did not meet Catherine's eyes until he had done. "Miss Muller," he said at last, voice formal and tight, "I spoke out of turn in the corridor. I was wrong." Catherine studied him for a beat, then inclined her head. "Then we are finished with it, Mr. Hale." Ravensmere handed Hale the first packet. "Take this to Magistrate Fenwick now. You will remain until he gives written acknowledgement." He handed a second to a younger footman waiting at the door. "Fleet Street office, to Mr. Barlow, the clerk. He will bring his receipt book and his statement under oath." Both men left at a run. Ravensmere turned to Catherine. "Your list." She drew a folded sheet from her sleeve. "My father's watch, my mother's cameo, 2 boxes of correspondence, if any survive, 1 green cloak taken by Miss Clara Voss, my writing desk, and tenancy bonds from the lower fields. I do not expect all of it." "You will recover what still exists," he said. "The rest will be entered as unlawful disposal." By 9 the house doors opened to daylight, and the first carriage wheels hissed on wet gravel. Leo's nursemaid Elsie came to the study with red eyes and steadier hands. She gave her account of the fall without evasion. The stairs had been overwaxed. She had turned for a blanket. Leo had run. Catherine listened and asked 3 exact questions about distance and timing. Ravensmere listened without expression. When Elsie finished, he said, "You are not dismissed." The girl covered her mouth and wept once, silently. He went on. "The west stair wax is to be stripped today. Resin sand on every tread by evening. Mrs. Davies, post it." "It is already in motion, Your Grace." A second carriage arrived before 10. Lavender reached the hall before the woman did. Lady Voss entered in violet silk and winter ermine, 2 steps behind a solicitor with silver spectacles and a leather portfolio. She stopped when she saw Catherine standing at Ravensmere's desk with documents in hand. "There you are," Lady Voss said, bright with outrage. "I have come for my stepdaughter and my household papers, both stolen in a fit of female derangement." Catherine felt old reflex rise in her throat, the urge to shrink, to apologise, to make herself small enough to survive. She set the reflex down like a weight she no longer intended to carry. "I took copies of accounts," she said. "I stole no property." Lady Voss laughed lightly. "She confesses as if that helps her." "It does," said a new voice from the doorway. Magistrate Fenwick entered with his clerk, reins still on his shoulders, Hale behind him, carrying the sealed acknowledgement. Fenwick was a hard-faced man in his 60s, with a barrister's caution and a farmer's hands. He bowed to Ravensmere, then to Lady Voss, then looked directly at Catherine. "I received your packet, Your Grace. We will hear this now." Lady Voss's colour shifted under powder. "Now, in a private house, in the presence of a magistrate, clerk, and named witnesses," Fenwick said. "Perfectly proper for preliminary deposition." They moved to the long drawing-room because it held the largest table and the least warmth. Clerks laid out papers. Mrs. Davies remained by the door as household witness. Mr. Barlow from Fleet Street arrived breathless, ink on his cuff, receipt book in hand. He gave sworn statement that 3 unsigned warnings had been left, with publication instructions if harm befell a woman in Lady Voss's household, and that he had delivered them to Ravensmere in October when figures matched disputed county claims. That external contact was entered, signed, and sealed. Then Catherine stood. She did not choose the easy path. She stated clearly that she had copied documents without permission. She stated where, when, and why. She placed each copied sheet against corresponding ledgers seized from Lady Voss's portfolio when Fenwick demanded production. Dates aligned. Flourishes did not. Her father's true hand slanted left and ended clean. The forged hand looped the M and dragged the final stroke. She named 12 tenant families threatened with eviction on false arrears. She named grain sold twice under wartime contracts. She named broker and carrier. Lady Voss interrupted 3 times. "Hysteria!" "Ingratitude!" "Fantasy!" Fenwick silenced her once with a raised finger, once with a warning, and once by ordering her seated. When Catherine finished, her mouth was dry enough to hurt. Ravensmere had said nothing through the entire deposition. He stood at her right shoulder and did not move so much as an inch, the stillness of him more forceful than argument. Lady Voss rose again, silk whispering like anger. "This is conspiracy," she snapped. "A plain girl invents accountancy, and a grieving duke indulges her." Ravensmere turned his head toward her, slow and exact. "She is under my protection." Fenwick's clerk paused, then wrote the line verbatim into the record. By midday the magistrate had signed warrants for seizure of Voss estate books and temporary injunction against tenant removals pending county hearing. 2 constables took custody of Lady Voss's ledgers in waxed bundles. Her solicitor attempted protest and was overruled. As she was escorted to her carriage, Lady Voss looked back at Catherine with a hatred so concentrated it seemed to thin her face. That look promised retaliation, ruin, any weapon left. It was a loaded promise. It never ripened. She was remanded that afternoon when additional contracts surfaced from county storage, and she did not return to Ravensmere House. 3 days later, under a white sky and sharp wind, Catherine stood in county chambers while formal charges were read: fraud, forgery, unlawful seizure of tenancies, and misrepresentation under wartime grain statutes. She repeated her testimony under oath. Mr. Barlow repeated his. Hale produced gate logs confirming dispatch times and messenger returns. Mrs. Davies produced household register and incident report with unaltered signatures, establishing chain and hour beyond dispute. Ellery testified only on Leo's injury timing, and his precision strengthened every sequence point. The overwaxed stare, the night entry, the immediate recording of events, all of it held together. Judgment came before dusk. Lady Voss was convicted and sentenced to transportation. Her remaining local assets were frozen for restitution review. The injunction became order. No tenant family from the Müller parcels would be removed on claims tied to disputed ledgers. Outside the chamber, wind drove sleet against the courthouse steps. Catherine stood beneath the portico with Ravensmere while clerks hurried past with tied files. Fenwick approached them and handed Catherine a folded order with his seal. "Temporary guardianship authority for your late father's remaining tenants," he said. "Supervised through Ravensmere Estate Office until final probate close. Use it well, Miss Müller." She took it with both hands. "I will." Fenwick looked once at Ravensmere. "You chose correctly." Ravensmere's answer was a slight incline of the head. By the second week of December, Catherine moved from the Blue Room to a small chamber above the West Library, with a writing desk placed under the window, and a lock whose key fit only her hand. Her father's watch was recovered from a drawer in Lady Voss's dressing-room inventory. Her mother's cameo was found in a jeweller's pledge book and redeemed. The green cloak did not return. It had been cut down and sold. The missing correspondence was entered as destroyed, and she wrote that line herself without shaking. Her ruined dress, folded on the chair that first night, had been cleaned and mended by Mrs. Davis's instruction, then stored in a cedar chest at Catherine's request. She kept it as evidence of weather, distance, and the price of arrival. In early spring, when crocuses lifted through thawed soil along the south walk, Ravensmere asked her to review the final tenants' schedules in the morning room open to the gardens. Sun touched the ink. The house no longer felt like borrowed shelter. It felt like work, honestly held. "These names are yours to manage now," he said, sliding the guardianship ledger toward her. "Ours," she corrected, because the rents would move through his estate office until probate closed. His mouth shifted once. Not quite a smile. This time it stayed. At noon they drove to a small assembly at Fenwick Hall, where county families gathered for the season's first charity subscription. The same kind of room that once would have watched her carry trunks without seeing her, now quieted when Ravensmere offered her his arm at the entrance and used her proper title before every introduction. "Miss Catherine Müller, Correspondence Secretary to Ravensmere and Guardian of the Müller tenancies, by court order." No one laughed. No one said useful if kept silent. They asked her about acreage, drainage, seed grain, school stipends. She answered each question in Clark's precision and field detail. Across the room, two women in silk whispered behind gloved hands, then stopped when Fenwick greeted her by name and bowed. At evening, back at Ravensmere, she found Leo in the library window seat with a bandage-free brow and a book too large for his lap. He looked up as she entered. "Miss Müller," he said with grave ceremony, "Uncle says I may run only where there are carpets." "A wise treaty," she said. He considered, then held out the book. "Read this one aloud." She did. Halfway through, Ravensmere paused at the doorway, listening, and for once did not leave before the end of the chapter. When the boys slept and the lamps were lowered, Catherine returned to the study to lock the dispatch box for the night. Every item was accounted for. Original copies sealed and filed with County Clerk receipt. Fleet Street notes archived by order. Incident report bound in household register. Guardianship order in active ledger. Restitution inventory. Pending disbursement. She turned the key, felt the bolt catch, and placed the key on its hook beside her desk. Ravensmere stood near the window, rain beginning again, in a soft April pattern against glass. He did not issue a command. Walk with me tomorrow, he said, at 9. Before correspondence, Catherine looked at him, at the man who had waited through winter and law and rumour, without once asking her to become smaller than she was. Her hand rested over the healed line in her palm. Yes, Your Grace, she said, and when she closed the study door behind her, she did it with steady hands.